This is Popular Front, a podcast focused on the niche details of modern warfare and underreported conflict with me, Jake Hanrahan. Today we're speaking to Richard Giragosian. He's the director of the Regional Studies Center in Armenia, and he's going to be talking to us about the recent border clashes between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Now, these are different because they didn't take place where they usually do in Nagorno-Karabakh, a contested area between Azerbaijan and Armenia. They took place along the country's border properly, so it's a very interesting situation. If you like what we're doing at Popular Front, please do consider supporting us at patreon.com/popularfront, or you can go to popularfront.co/support. So before we get into what's happening now and this kind of stalemate again, I just want to go over what actually happened last month when the clashes took place on the border, because it wasn't Nagorno-Karabakh, right? This was Armenia versus Azerbaijan proper.
Well, basically on Sunday, July 12th, the Azerbaijanis launched a very limited campaign designed to take control of a hilltop that is fairly strategic in terms of overlooking roads on the Azerbaijani side. Basically, it caught us all off guard in terms of those observing the situation, because what happened was the initial assault was a little bit half-hearted, but quickly escalated. And it was more based on misperception and miscalculation than any professional military logic. And then it lasted for a good 4 to 5 days, where they attempted 2 more assaults, trying to at least take control of this hilltop. Now, the Armenian side was caught unprepared, but was basically endowed with the advantage of the defender and had a tremendous advantage in terms of terrain and topography, and fairly easily repulsed the offensive. But it also triggered an escalation of battle space in terms of bringing in a tank, only one, mind you, and artillery, and capped or topped off with UAVs, with drone warfare.
Right, and there's not normally that kind of equipment in that space, right? It's generally quite a quiet area. Was it Tavush, was it?
Yeah. In other words, that border area is a hotspot only in terms of sporadic sniper fire to violate the ceasefire in effect. But it generally does not involve any military campaign for territory, because it's been, 300 kilometers away from Nagorno-Karabakh, where the real dispute is centered. And this is why it was really driven more by politics in Azerbaijan, frustration, justifiable frustration over diplomacy, and an attempt to actually, by force of arms, kind of up the ante, if you will. So it wasn't just about Armenia. It was much beyond Nagorno-Karabakh. It was also a message to the international community and a message to the mediators.
Right, and when you say they, the Azeris started this small offensive, what did they actually do?
Unlike Nagorno-Karabakh, this was designed to regain an element of surprise that's been missing since the April 2016 fighting over Nagorno-Karabakh. And it was not preceded by any real reconnaissance, nor any kind of artillery barrage. Rather, it was this rather comical, from an American perspective, driving close to the hill, literally in a civilian vehicle designed to probe and test reaction. It seems that the intelligence was faulty. In other words, the Armenian defensive positions were much stronger than anticipated. And this is why it quickly turned from the comical or the farcical into the deadly. Because once committed, for the Azerbaijanis, it was difficult, if not impossible, to disengage.
Right, and so they got warned from what I read. The Armenians said, "Look, you got to go away," right? But they came back.
Oh yeah, and they came back, and then they tried on 3 separate occasions to retake this hill. Now, having said that, as usual, there is not a black and white dimension. In other words, my criticism militarily is it was the Armenian side that also provoked in 2 ways. One is by enhancing their defensive fortifications on top of the hill. That was a bit of a provocation. In other words, that was a changed landscape from usual. Secondly, the Armenians, after the first day of fighting, into the second and third day, were kind of trying to reestablish deterrence by almost an overreaction in terms of punishing for the offensive. And this is both bluff and bluster, but also in terms of firing on and downing the UAVs, which is also unusual.
Yeah, and it went on for a few days, right? And there was several soldiers killed. What happened? They came to a ceasefire or what?
Well, here's the interesting thing is, unlike the April 2016 fighting, which was the most serious, there were 2 differences. One is, unlike the 5 days of fighting back in 2016, this time, after 4 days of fighting, it was only the parties on the ground, the local commanders, who basically recognized the deadlock or the stalemate and ceased firing. There was no international engagement or mediation. Russia was actually reacting and responding, but not managing the situation. The second big difference was the Azerbaijanis lost 4 mid-level ranking officers, majors and colonels, and 1 general, which is extremely unusual for such a front-line skirmish.
Why was the general up there, do you think?
I think it was more about politics within the Ministry of Defense, probably pulling like a Norman Schwarzkopf kind of, or a Patton kind of ego over caution. But not just the general. I mean, losing colonels and majors in such a border skirmish is very unusual.
Yeah, so bearing all that in mind, like what, for the Azerbaijanis, it was a big problem, like it's a big mess now. Why do you think they struck there instead of Nagorno-Karabakh? Like you said that there was a lot of political stuff going on. Maybe you can explain that a bit for us.
Well, I think in many ways they sense, probably based partly on a misreading of the situation, they sense a degree of weakness in the Armenian government of today that is actually exaggerated. In other words, the Azerbaijanis have become increasingly overconfident, both militarily, but also in terms of a misperception, sensing an opportunity of weakness within the Armenian government that frankly does not exist. So I do think this was lashing out at Armenia proper. It was also sending a message in a justified way of their deep frustration from the lack of progress over the peace process with Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, where they negotiate directly with Armenia rather than Karabakh itself. Now, what this also means is the danger and risk looking ahead, where no matter how justified diplomatic frustration can be, to manifest into force of arms greatly enhances the risk matrix. And what we see in terms of threat misperception is this is a dangerous escalation that could quickly spiral out of control and inherently based on miscalculation rather than sound military science or logic.
Right, and do you think that's different then to what happened in 2016? Because that did spin out of control very fast. But I don't know, do you think that was more calculated?
Yes. In other words, if we look back at April 2016, what was most significant was it was a rare military victory for Azerbaijan. And to their credit, it was a victory because it was a limited military campaign with limited objectives and clear objectives. Their desire was to simply seize and secure territory in and around Nagorno-Karabakh. And in many ways, unlike the past, where they would attack just for the sake of attacking, this was professional and more calculated, more planned, unlike this recent fighting. What it also represents is the changed landscape in two ways. One is there is no longer any real deterrence. No one and nothing is really preventing Azerbaijan from consistently resorting to the force of arms. And there's also no longer an element of surprise, which also militarily makes such offensives much harder to do. In this context, another change or difference is, unlike in 2016, I'm more concerned now because with the COVID-19 crisis, we have a much more vulnerable population on both sides of the border. In other words, Armenian and Azerbaijani villagers, civilians, have been forced to stay at home, are much more exposed and vulnerable in the face of renewed hostilities. And moreover, if we look at the geopolitical context, this is a World War I style potential conflict that will compel or force a response and a reaction by several larger regional players. Russia and Turkey, obviously, but even Iran would be confronted with a challenge in terms of whether this continues to escalate. And militarily, it's logical now, after this deadlock or stalemate, to expect a further increase in tension through the summer months and look closely after the joint military exercises between Turkey and Azerbaijan, a dangerous degree of overconfidence where the Azerbaijani side may be further emboldened to bring an attack also against Nagorno-Karabakh proper.
Yeah, well, I've spoken to so many people about this because I read Black Garden years ago and I've been fascinated with Nagorno-Karabakh ever since. And I've said to so many people, like, you might not even know about this conflict, but it's like you've said, if it does flare up, it's not just going to be contained within those borders. All of these people are going to get involved. Russia is in a weird position, right? I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they have bases in Armenia, but are also supplying Azerbaijan with weapons.
Well, here's the interesting, almost trivia aspect of what makes this conflict so different and unique. On the one hand, Russia has emerged in recent years as the #1 arms provider to all sides of the conflict,
right,
supplying Armenia and Azerbaijan. Ironically, Armenia gets discounted weapons, whereas Azerbaijan, especially because of its energy wealth, pays full ticket price for all weapon systems. What we see, therefore, is a dangerous arms race, increased and even surging defense spending in Azerbaijan, and, like boys with toys, a dangerous accumulation of much more modern offensive weapon systems. But the second aspect of this that makes it so different is this is the only so-called frozen conflict where Russia has no military presence whatsoever. There is no Russian direct control over events on the ground in Nagorno-Karabakh, which on the one hand makes Russia perhaps at risk for potentially seeking the insurance or the leverage of a potential future role, perhaps deploying Russian peacekeepers like it does in other hotspots. And we all know Russian peacekeepers, there's no such thing. And second, once deployed, they never go home. Interestingly, if there's one point of agreement between Armenia, Nagorno-Karabakh, and Azerbaijan, it's all against, in unity, against the deployment of any Russian peacekeeping force. It's the only point of agreement. And at the same time, Turkey has greatly lost power and influence in the region, not just because of the aborted normalization process with Armenia, but because it was replaced by Russia as the primary arms patron for Azerbaijan. So this is also a new context. What's interesting, however, is the optimism. Militarily, as an analyst, I am impressed that this is a rare ceasefire agreement in Nagorno-Karabakh that has no international security guarantee whatsoever. It's a rare achievement of a ceasefire being upheld simply by the parties to the conflict themselves. Even the monitoring is weak, symbolic at best, without even one UAV at the disposal of the so-called OSCE monitors. It's a joke. But at the same time, in addition to the absence of deterrence, there's also little punitive price to pay for any side that violates the ceasefire. And this is a problem as well. And finally, what's most distressing is it's only a matter of time. On the one hand, Azerbaijan is increasingly tempted, both for a domestic distraction and also in terms of being too tempted not to try again in terms of launching military operations. And at the same time, with the accumulated weapon systems, the expansion of the battle space to include air power, UAVs, and more offensive weapon systems, I'm greatly worried that this is setting up the perfect storm, if you will, of renewed conflict in a rather ignored, if not isolated region that has great power potential in terms of a new dynamic landscape in a race to the bottom in terms of conflict, both unexpected and in a place unforeseen.
And what is happening politically right now in Azerbaijan that they thought now is a good time to do all this?
Well, on the one hand, there's a sense of almost running out of time. Like Syria years ago, there was a passing of power from presidential power from father to son. The current president of Azerbaijan, President Ilham Aliyev, is sitting with a legitimacy that is solely based on genetics rather than any kind of elections. This is inherently dangerous. And I do think with the global slump in oil prices, the energy wealth of Azerbaijan increasingly means much less in terms of geopolitical power, and the sense that time is running out. And this was a sense of playing the nationalist card, using the conflict in order to not just bolster meager legitimacy, but to ride the tiger of nationalism. It's very dangerous to stay in control of such a risky gambit. But this is why we see a power struggle within Azerbaijan as well that is defining and driving this new round of fighting, a power struggle where the old guard Soviet generation of advisors of the president's father are being forced out, and a new younger elite is being ushered into senior positions within Azerbaijan. But the other second element here, in 2018, in a rare non-violent victory of people power, there was a change of government in Armenia, capped by December 2018, which had a rare free and fair election for Armenia. In other words, the coming to power of a deeply popular and more democratic government in Armenia is also an inherent threat to Azerbaijan. It's also, mind you, an inherent threat to Russia and to President Putin for what it stands for. And this is actually the more interesting new dynamic.
And he's I forget his name, sorry, the new leader in Armenia, but he's been yeah, right. He's been quite I don't know, when it was all happening, I kept my eye on it, and he seemed to be quite like he was the guy that really wanted to focus on Nagorno-Karabakh, right? Like more so than the previous leaders.
Well, here's the key difference. As a more democratic leader, Prime Minister Pashinyan has another advantage. Beyond popular support, he has no baggage. He has no connection to Nagorno-Karabakh, unlike the two previous Armenian leaders who came to power not only from Nagorno-Karabakh, but came to power in Armenia because of Nagorno-Karabakh and the conflict. Pashinyan is very much a civilian, a Democrat, with pronounced legitimacy, meaning that he can afford to lead public opinion and no longer be prisoner of public opinion, meaning that we have expectations of more statesmanship from the Armenian leader. For Azerbaijan, that's a challenge. This is also a new breed of politician that the Azerbaijanis have little experience in dealing with. And frankly, to draw an illustration, the two former presidents of Armenia, Robert Kocharyan, Serge Sargsyan, were both from Nagorno-Karabakh and were known quantities, educated in the Soviet system. For the Azerbaijani side, there was a common ground, a common language. But with Pashinyan, as a more democratic, much younger, new generation leader, it is inherently a challenge for the Azerbaijani leadership to even understand his political perspective.
And how is he doing now? I know at the time, like, everybody seemed to love him. I never forget that footage where the military basically like left their barracks and were like, yeah, we're with the protesters now. Has he still remained popular, or are people kind of not sure now?
Well, no, he still maintains overwhelming public support. I mean, several very professional, prominent public opinion surveys have estimated at still over 75% favorable ratings. Now, having said that, a lot of that popularity is due not only to the fact that for the ordinary people, they see the prime minister as one of them. He's not corrupt, he's by no means wealthy, and he came to power from the street as a protest leader. The Martin Luther King in terms of nonviolence rather than the Malcolm X. But at the same time, we must admit his popularity is also rooted in the fact that there is no alternative. The former government was so arrogant in power and so corrupt that it has become marginal, totally discredited. So the absence of an opposition force not only makes the prime minister more powerful, but I see it as a negative. The lack of a constructive opposition is a bad thing, even for the Armenian government, as well as for democratization. But he's still popular, and this is unlikely to diminish. Now, going forward, the real threat to Pashinyan is not from the former government. The real threat for stability is dangerously high expectations from the population, which have only increased with the pressure of the COVID-19 lockdown and crisis. And I think the real test will come, economic recovery from COVID-19. That's going to be a more serious threat than anything Russia can do, and even anything Azerbaijan will threaten. But at the same time, I'm optimistic. Armenia is much more stable and is seeking a partner for peace and seeking a way out of the albatross or the burden of conflict.
And what do you make of these new, I don't even know what to call them, to be honest, I guess scare tactics on Twitter? The Azerbaijani Ministry of Defense have been posting these outrageous kind of photoshops, but they've been saying like, yeah, Turkey is training with us, and there's certainly reports that Turkey is, you know, heading over to help out, you know, bolster up the Azerbaijani military in terms of training. Do you think that's just scare tactics, or what? Do you think it's, I don't know, something more?
Well, to be honest, I'm a former instructor for the U.S. Army Special Forces, and from my own experience and expertise, these kind of amateur, primitive, cartoon-like demonstrations only demonstrate the weakness and the lack of professionalism. So if anything, it reassures me that we have no fear of an official declaration of war or any kind of sophisticated military campaign. However, I see the risk as even more deadly, and that is a risk of a war by accident based on miscalculation. Bluff and bluster not only reveals weakness, but also demonstrates a danger for unnecessary loss of life militarily.
Do you think this time then, if it does kick off, like, you know, it's looking like it possibly will do you think the international community will have the same response? Like in 2016, it was very, very quick and kind of on point, like, yes, we can't have this. And like you said, with this one, it's been quite quiet. Obviously, we know a hell of a lot has changed with the international community since then. What do you think their response might be? I know it's hard to tell, but
I think the response will be very different, and for several reasons. First is, let's be honest, with the COVID-19 situation, not only are many in the international community distracted, but perhaps even unable, let alone unwilling, to react forcefully to any renewed hostilities. Second, again with COVID-19, energy. Oil and gas are much less important geopolitically if we look at the changing landscape of the global economy. This also means that Azerbaijan has much less clout than it once did with British Petroleum and the oil companies. And the third difference here is, just as this conflict is a very local conflict, but with regional potential and implications, I think the key to resolving the conflict, as well as the challenge to limit or mitigate the risk of war, lies in the hands of local parties to the conflict and much less to the international community. And further, or lastly, the unpredictable nature of the Trump administration means that the U.S. has been neglecting and even withdrawing from this region as a whole for a number of years now, meaning that there's only one surprise player here. Believe it or not, it's the European Union, who was the only geopolitical pretender or aspirant who were able to bring in the Armenian and Azerbaijani foreign ministers on a mediated video conference in the hours following the end of this escalation. No one else could do it. So I would not underestimate European Union engagement. Also, for Moscow, it's much more acceptable than, say, NATO or the United States. And as well, this is a reflection of Russian weakness and insecurity, not confidence and power. This is not Ukraine, nor is it Belarus in that regard.
In that respect, then, thinking about what you just said, then, do you think if, and I know I'm asking like a lot of what ifs, but I think it's a potential, you know, like you said, a kind of powder keg. But if the conflict does kind of kick off again, do you think that then Russia are actually going to get involved, like, properly, or do you think they just kind of sit back? The same with Turkey as well. Like, they always say, yeah, we'll come immediately, we'll be there for Azerbaijan, but they're stretched very thin right now in quite a lot of wars. Do you think this will actually have, like, you know, backing from these powers?
Well, let's take Turkey first. Turkey was actually uncharacteristically rash and actually counterproductive in its response to the recent fighting. The Turkish president, who we all know is very much an impulsive character, actually affirmed Turkish support for Azerbaijan even before the facts were in. In other words, it was a blind embrace. Other more reasonable people in the Turkish government, including the foreign minister, have been a little more cautious and prudent. And the real fear for Turkey is not just the overextension, the commitments in Libya, in Syria, etc. The real danger is the little brother of the relationship, Azerbaijan, is in charge of Turkey's reaction and options. The fear in Ankara is that Azerbaijan may force Turkey into a conflict not with Armenia, but with Russia. And this is something that even Erdogan does not want. Yet another flare-up of a confrontation with Putin. We saw what this meant a couple of years ago with the Turkish downing of a Russian military aircraft. This will be a big deal. Now, turning to Russia, I think the real challenge in military terms, if we talk about teeth to tail, is the logistic nightmare. For example, Russia's deployment potentially into the region is an impossibility. Georgian airspace is closed. Azerbaijan would not open its airspace. It has no border with Armenia. In other words, the logistical challenge alone of any Russian intervention would be extremely difficult and would be dangerous. They would be vulnerable in terms of an overextended and vulnerable supply chain and logistical chain. At the same time, the Russian military base in Armenia is a Cold War legacy. It's along the border with NATO member Turkey, and it's very much a plant the flag presence. It has no military capability other than an Air Force squadron. But it seems very unlikely, especially in terms of terrain and topography in Nagorno-Karabakh, where combat rotary wing assets are much more applicable. I don't really think Russia can even move the assets into theater that it would need.
That's a good point. I didn't even think about that, to be honest. The place where they are geographically is just not great.
Right. It's like an American invasion of Iran would be impossible.
Yeah. With that in mind, then, with Aliyev, like a lot of people were out on the streets in Azerbaijan, basically saying, "Why won't you go to war?" Like, it's very strange to see that. Normally, it's the other way around. But do you think this is going to affect him if he doesn't kind of push back on this?
It already has. In other words, when I referred earlier in our conversation to Aliyev's dangerous riding of the tiger of nationalism, this is what I'm referring to. For Aliyev, this was an unexpected sudden outburst, a demonstration of national rage calling for war. So much so that thousands of demonstrators stormed to the Azerbaijani parliament. This actually shook the regime, scared the leadership. In many ways later, much of this storming of parliament was blamed on the opposition for attempting a so-called coup d'etat. It shows the paranoia, but also the defensive stance. I think Aliyev is beginning to fall off his ride of the tiger of nationalism. And the other problem is in Azerbaijan, there's no steam valve for dissent. It's so authoritarian, and even in recent weeks, there's a renewed crackdown on the marginal opposition as well as civil society. I think it's actually raising tension within Azerbaijan. And for me, the challenge to Armenian national security is from a weak, perhaps revolutionary moment in Azerbaijan itself. That's a different challenge than facing a military predictable rival over a ceasefire line. And I'm greatly worried about the implications of Islamists seizing an opportunity within Azerbaijan. Ironically, Turkey, although Sunni Muslim, has close relations, but Azerbaijan is a Shia state. And neighboring Iran may actually raise the stakes here as well.
Yeah, I remember when even in 2016, some of the Azerbaijani soldiers were, allegedly doing some kind of jihadist level stuff. Like I think 2 old people had their ears cut off. It was just disgusting, I think, in Talish as well. One thing that has also surprised me, I don't know if you've seen it, I imagine you have, that like not only did this kind of kick off in Azerbaijan, across the world, we've been seeing like, Armenian protesters are being attacked in Istanbul, in Russia, in UK, in London. We had it. Like some Armenians had a protest, and they're just Azerbaijanis like literally attacking them all over the place. It seems like a very, it's a very big issue for the whole community, I think.
Well, you raise an interesting point in specifically because this also shows why this recent escalation is so different. In other words, the reaction is because this was not an attack in a disputed conflict context over Nagorno-Karabakh. This was a military offensive against Armenia proper, which is not a direct party in terms of Nagorno-Karabakh. It's a negotiator. This was unprecedented in scale, hence the reaction in the Armenian diaspora. But one interesting thing I'll observe, and this is after I do have to say and criticize any and all violence, whether it's by the Azerbaijanis or the Armenians in the diaspora. This is very counterproductive and very irresponsible. What's interesting, though, is the contrast. Unlike the diaspora, and greatly unlike Azerbaijan, there aren't any demonstrations in Armenia. There's a big contrast, a divergence of views. In Armenia, there's worry and concern, memory of what war really is, rather than some romanticized nationalist narrative. In Armenia, both in the parliament and the government, the nationalist parties are not represented. In other words, moderates have returned to power, and the militant voices have become marginalized, unlike Azerbaijan. Fortunately, if we look at the reaction to the fighting, even the prime minister's wife's social media reaction was a call for peace builders, peacemakers to come to the fore. In other words, a time for reason, a return to diplomacy, rather than giving in to the temptation of rage and nationalist demonstrations. So I think that's important to note, also because it gives a degree of optimism that a more democratic, more moderate Armenian government may be the best partner Azerbaijan could ever hope for in returning to diplomatic negotiations.
Has that affected, though, the military in Armenia? Like, does that mean less youths are joining up, or what's the state of the military there now?
Well, military in Armenia, because we're a very small country with a population of under 3 million, it's a conscription force that relies on defense reform, stressing quality over quantity. And to be honest, unlike Azerbaijan, we have no history of a military coup. Civil-military relations is one of the rare foundations in Armenian statehood. And actually, the Armenian military has no offensive appetite. There's no threat of territorial demand on any of its neighbors. And in fact, if we look at districts of Azerbaijan outside the borders of Nagorno-Karabakh that are held by the Armenian forces as demilitarized buffer zones, they're also bargaining chips as concessions in the negotiated resolution of the conflict. So I think with no offensive threat from the Armenian military, this also made the attack by Azerbaijan on Armenia even more surprising.
Right. Yeah, definitely. Richard, thank you very much. Is there anything else you think we should go over before we kind of wrap this up?
Not really. I think you hit everything.
Yeah, man, definitely. And where can people follow your work if they want to get hold of you and, you know, see what you've written recently on this?
Well, of course, I'm on Twitter. It's Richard_RSC. And my think tank in Armenia, an independent think tank, is the Regional Studies Center. And there aren't many think tanks in Armenia, so it wouldn't be hard to find.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll be in touch, Jake. Thank you.
That was Richard Giragosian telling us all about the current situation between Armenia and Azerbaijan and why that might really kick off anytime soon. It's not looking good. If you like what we're doing at Popular Front, please do consider supporting us at patreon.com/popularfront. There is bonus episodes, access to the community Discord. There's a video series now, which is like an educational series, basically trying to say to people like, look, here's some advice or tips on whatever, everything from what to do in an armed clash, what kind of bulletproof plates you'll need if you're on a front line, how to deal with yourself if you get attacked with tear gas or whatever in a clash. There will be filming tutorials, there will be how to identify certain weapons. There's going to be all sorts coming from people involved with Popular Front. That is a series called Too Cool for J School, and you can get that on the Patreon, patreon.com/popularfront. This episode was sponsored by Oracle Coffee Shop in Portland, Oregon, USA. They're an independent coffee shop selling only fair trade products. See them at 3875 Southwest Bond Avenue 97239. Tell them Popular Front sent you. Say hi to Frank for me. This episode is also sponsored by Grindcore House, a pair of independent coffee shops in Philadelphia, USA. There's one in South and one in West. Check them out on social media at Grindcore House. The episode is also sponsored by Propagandopolis, an outlet selling and informing people about historical conflict propaganda posters. Get prints at propagandopolis.com. Check them out. If you want to follow us on social medias, you can follow me at twitter.com/Jake_Hanrahan, HANRAHAN. I'm on there quite often talking shit and sharing news on various conflicts around the world. Or you can follow us on Twitter at PopularFrontCO. youtube.com/popularfront, or you can go to popularfront.tv. I'm working on a website just for our video content to host that there, but right now it redirects to the YouTube. What else? Instagram.com/popular.front. We're fucking flying on the Instagram now. It's got I think fucking 80,000 nearly followers, so it's mad. Yeah, it's doing well there. We often post a lot of our merchandise stuff there first, just because it's that kind of audience, very visual. Yeah, so the merchandise as well is at popularfront.shop. I know we've got about 1,000 fucking websites at the minute. I don't really know how it's ended up like that, but there you go. Yeah, and as always, please do consider supporting us on the Patreon, patreon.com/popularfront. Thank you very much to the following Patreons. They are Jav, Bastian Gemello Ritzmeyer, Ian Froish. Again, I think I might have said all of those wrong. Apologies if I have. Do message me and let me know. James Cully, Michael Akakan, Ethan Reyes, Fitz Madrid, Joe Watt, Alex Northrop, Ed Coulthard, Johnny LaFleur, Clayton Taylor, Hugo Newski, Maxwell Burke, BIEN86, Anthony Kabarik, Don Wayne, Scott Hopton, Liam Williams, Fragile Feeling, Chris Cusimano, Sebastian, Degenerate Zero Alpha, Chris Davis, D.R., Trey Nance, Charlie, Olin Thorne, Amy Rupert, Rubicon, Prashant Singh, Azad, Frank Austin, Amelia Me, Christina Rivetti, Moody Al Rashid, Bill Wilson, Emiliano, Andrew Hurley, Vida Provost, Brian McLaughlin, Ari from the Discord, Young Wasabi, Sarushe Hawazi, Tony Bin, Adam Berg Snyder, Scartoon Music, Stephen Davila, Patrick Bronte, Dan Dunham, Fletcher Tate, Chad Walker, Diana Gorvanek, Q Ball, Lawrence Abrahams, Peter McCormick from What Bitcoin Did podcast and Defiance, Emily Molly, Axel Iverson, Christopher Martin, Ryan Sandercock, Daniel Shearer, and Joanne Stocker. Thank you all so much. It's amazing to see how many people are actually supporting on this Patreon right now. It's incredible. When I started it, I was like, right, hopefully I can make some money to cover the show costs, and then maybe, if it gets bigger, we'll maybe be able to do a documentary here and there. Now it's at a point where we're very quickly kind of about to hit a goal where if that happens, then we're going to start doing a full-on Popular Front series, a video documentary series, which will also become like an audio doc series as well. It'll be called Bad Signal, the wars you won't see in the news. Basically, I'll be going to these areas and filming conflicts that are ongoing that you just don't ever hear about, mad, we spoke a lot about Nagorno-Karabakh in this episode. You'll be seeing footage from there, maybe Libya, plenty of other places, Rojava. Again, there's various conflicts within conflicts there that you just don't see about. Where else? In fact, I might even have a look, because I've got, the Ambazonia conflicts in Nigeria. That will probably be one. I'm gonna have a look here because, oh good, the search function isn't working. Okay, there we go. Yeah, other places would be like Kashmir, maybe Congo. There's all sorts going on in the like there's the clashes in the Congo are like outrageous. You just don't hear about it. The Philippines, there's still a lot going on there. Ukraine, we go to Ukraine, you know, we film there and be like, why is no one fucking talking about this war anymore? I think it'd be a fun series and something that would be really interesting to a lot of people. If you've got any like tips or like places you think, yeah, you should go if we get to this goal and we do get to make this series, please do message me on the Patreon or email me at jake@hanrahan.tv or whatever places that you know about where you think, you know, they should probably be covered in a series like that. Do let me know. Anyway, thanks very much. The intro music was by an artist called Home, and the outro, as usual, was by Sam Black, aka Son of Old. Check him out at samblackpf.com. And if there's any beats from like episodes that you think, yeah, I wish we could hear that on the SoundCloud, just hassle him. Tell him I said you can hassle him, and he might put them up if he wants to. It's up to him, obviously, but he might put them up on his SoundCloud. Cheers.